Welcome to A Christian Response with me, Dave Piper, on TWR-UK. In this series, we're taking a look at how Christians are responding to some of the major issues in communities across the UK and around the world. We're finding out what motivates people to stand up for those in poverty, to tackle human trafficking, and to champion those in the latter years of their lives, amongst many other issues. We're speaking to church leaders, charity staff, experts and volunteers to get a grasp of the numerous problems in our communities that can be fixed by prayer, practical action and political intervention. We're taking lessons from Scripture about how we as followers of Christ should respond to those around us. If you'd like to get in touch to share your thoughts on anything you hear this week on the programme, then please do feel free to email us. The email address is studio@twr.org.uk. That's studio@twr.org.uk. We're joined this week by Graeme Hodge, the global CEO of United World Schools, and in a previous employment working across the humanitarian and aid sector across the world. And we're talking this week about a couple of topics which will have come across your desk many, many times, I'm sure, and that is war and conflict and refugees. And it might seem odd to some to mention war and refugees in the same sentence. They might see those as very separate concepts, but they are very intrinsically linked, aren't they? This idea of people seeing conflict in their neighbourhood and the mass movement of people literally fleeing for their lives.
Absolutely, Dave. Those two things are inextricably linked. And in some ways, when we think about the reality of that situation, it's not that surprising. If you have a situation where bombs are being dropped on the place where you live and have called home, your place of safety, your sanctuary, naturally your human inclination is that you want to leave, you want to go to some place of safety. We only have to look back in our own history in the UK at how people have done that throughout the Second World War, for example. They sent children and families to the countryside to escape the situation in London, for example, where bombs were dropping. We saw mass migration coming from Europe, particularly Jews and persecuted groups fleeing to safety from Europe. And so this has been something that's consistent both through modern, recent and current history, that these two things are inextricably linked. People seek safety and they want that for them and their families.
Just as shine a sidelight on this almost, talking about refugees in the Second World War, and many of us will have studied at school or have talked to older relatives about this. We got that concept, haven't we, of parents really regretfully leaving their children on train platforms, tears in their eyes as they watch them go off to a safer place, not knowing if they'll see them again. Can that help us to get a grasp of the essential humanity of this topic?
Absolutely. I mean, you think about the reality of that situation, and I think all of us, especially if we're parents, but even if we're not, just the empathy for people in that situation, to think that I would put my child onto a train to go and stay in a place that I don't really know with people I don't know, because that's a better option than where they are now. I mean, that is something that we wouldn't even contemplate in our day-to-day lives, and yet that reality is what refugees face today. You've got 117 million people who are forcibly displaced at the moment. About 42 million of those are classified as refugees. So you've got 117 million people globally who are moved from their homes because it's not a safe place for them to be. And a further, just under half of that number essentially having to flee to another place altogether, another country, a totally different culture, context, to find safety, and I think when we put it into that context of what we've experienced and what we have subjected our own children to, albeit historically, our ancestors, our sort of grandparents, etc., I think we can start to build a greater empathy for the situation that people find themselves in today. People don't choose to go in a dinghy as an easy choice. They're choosing that because it is still it's the best of two worst options, basically. That's still a better option than where they're coming from, than the land that they're leaving. And so I think when we start to think about refugees, we have to get to that reality of what is it that's drawing people to a situation where they're having to flee safety. I'm not talking about people who are seeking a better life. There is that as well, and there's good context for some of that too. But when we're talking about refugees, we're talking about people who are leaving because they have no other better choice.
And does this really tie back in again the concept of war and refugees being linked? Because there will be people, won't there, around the world who flee from conflict only to find the place they've gone to becomes part of the front line and they have to flee again.
Absolutely. I mean, this happens time and time again. We're seeing it throughout Sudan. We're seeing it through Eritrea. We're seeing it in places, we've seen it historically in places like Syria, for example. Time and time again, it's very seldom do they just sort of up and leave and go to another country. Most people don't have the means, like you and I, to be able to do that. If we were found in that situation, it would be very difficult. I remember going and visiting, when I worked with the Methodist Relief and Development Agency, going and visiting refugee camps in Jordan. 80,000 Syrian refugees were in that particular camp. And, the people that were there had been there for 7 years by that stage. That's a very, very long time. But also, the people that were there when they had first moved there were people like doctors, were professionals, were finance executives, were teachers. These were people who had a good living, a good home, a good way of life. And yet, by force of circumstances, found themselves as refugees fleeing to another country because that was their only option. And after 7 years, these people were no longer financially independent. They were dependent on aid, handouts, etc., because their whole world had been turned upside down. But they had sought that, despite that being a horrific option to have to choose, they'd sought that because that was the only way they could find safety for themselves and their families.
And it must be particularly painful for people like that, because is it fair to say that they might have fled for their lives, but they still see home as home?
Absolutely. I mean, most of those people, even now, are questioning, will I ever be able to go back to Syria? Yes, there has been some return of Syrian people back to Syria since Assad, the former president and dictator, was overthrown. But actually, there are many, many people who have been away for such a long period of time that they've had children who've been born in other countries who are now know nothing of Syria from where they came from. And also, for many of them, what have they got to go back to? Their homes have been destroyed. They no longer have things like papers that prove that they own land in this particular place or a job to go to. What is it that they can actually return to? And you overlay that with current situations like what's happening in Gaza. For those people, what is it that they're returning to? They have nowhere else to go. And yet, what have they got to go back to? You see that in Eritrea, you see that in Sudan, you see that in all these conflicts around the world, even people from Ukraine as well. Same situation. They're making a life for them. At some point, you have to start to settle into a place of permanency in some way, shape, or form, however temporary your status might be, because that's survival. That's the human condition. We need that sort of safety sanctuary. We need a place to call home that's safe. And after many, many years, it's very difficult for refugees to have any other option than to stay where they are.
You're listening to A Christian Response on TWR-UK with me, Dave Piper. Over the course of this series, we're taking a look at how Christians are responding to some of the major issues in communities across the UK and around the world. We're finding out what motivates Christians to pray and act, and what the Bible teaches us about our duties and responsibilities to those around us. If you'd like to get in touch to share your thoughts on the issues we're covering, then please do feel free to email. The email address is studio@twr.org.uk. That's studio@twr.org.uk. Do you think it's particularly difficult for children, whether they fled with their families, whether they have been born as refugees? Because obviously for the adults, they've they've developed their skills, they've had the education they've had the life experience they've had. But children are the next generation. They start with a blank slate.
They do start with a blank slate, but I think also sometimes those children who might flee as refugees, I don't think we can underestimate the huge impact that that has on a child. Adults experience enough trauma as it is. Children are very adaptable, but there is trauma that goes with that sense of complete lack of safety and security, of leaving home, of having everything upended and coming to a strange place, of not knowing how to speak the language, of going into a situation where even though they were in a place of real conflict and lack of safety previously, they go to another place where they're not sure if it is safe because they don't know anything about it. It's a foreign place. So it's not an easy thing for them to do. But children born into a situation is as you say, it's a whole different dynamic in that they are, I guess, inheriting this emotional trauma of their parents and the family around them. But they don't know that reality for themselves because they've only ever known where they are now. And so then to be faced with a situation, as many families are, where those children are being threatened with deportation and being sent back to allegedly where they came from, is incredibly traumatic because they don't identify with that being their home. So there is a really complex series of scenarios when it comes to refugees. It's not a straight up problem of shutting all the doors and pulling up the drawbridges. There is so much more complexity to the reasons why people flee. There's so much more complexity to why they need safety. And there's so much more complexity to how we treat people fairly and equally as fellow human beings and show a love for our neighbours around the world.
Graeme, you mentioned the statistics at the start of this interview about the number of people who are displaced or have fled as refugees around the world. Do you think here in the UK we actually fully grasp the scale of that, though, compared to maybe what we think of as our own immigration crisis?
No, I don't think we do at all. I mean, you and I would be painfully aware. We can't help but see on the media, the newspapers, almost every week, there's another story about small boats and being bombarded by small boats. And, the reality is that represents around about, I think in 2025, there was about 41,500 people arrived via small boats compared to the total immigration figure of close to 700,000 of non-EU nationals coming into the UK. So small boat arrivals represent only about 6% of all people moving to the UK. And if you look at the total footfall of people entering into the UK, including, visitors, British nationals returning, all those different types of people, there were about 136, I think, million arrivals in the year ending September 2025. So small boats only roughly account for about 0.03% of that total movement. So we are not being overrun by people. Yes, 40,000 people is a lot of people, but in the big scheme of things, it's actually not. And I think there's often a perception that all refugees arrive on boats. And this is being perpetuated by this small boats problem, as it's called in our media and in the rhetoric that surrounds it. But the reality is far more nuanced. I think when you look at, for example, asylum seekers, it's roughly about 52% of people, I think, claiming asylum arrived via, what they call irregular routes. So primarily small boats. But about 38% of people, who eventually claimed asylum in 2025, at least, according to those figures, actually entered the UK legally, first on work or study or visitor visas before applying for protection. Historically, when we look at then the people that are arriving on boats, coming back to that actually about 60 to 70% of those people who arrive on small boats are eventually recognized as genuine refugees by the UK government. So they are seen, and it's a very hard process, a very high benchmark to be proven in this. But because they often come from high conflict areas, places like Afghanistan, which we know very well in terms of our own involvement in the war and the conflict and the situation there, places like Eritrea, places like Syria. So, these are the people that are coming. let's get it in perspective in terms of the wider numbers, but also let's understand that actually these are people with genuine stories. Yes, of course, there are some who are seeking a better life and are seeking ways to earn income. And actually, even then, I have empathy for those people, because when you compare to where they've come from and the opportunities that they have, those will be severely limited due to extreme poverty. But even putting that aside, we're still talking about 70% of those people, at least, who are genuine refugees, who have met that high benchmark that put in place by the UK government, put in place by UN standards, put in place by any sort of measure of humanitarian need. And these are people who need a safe place to go, and we have the means, we have the resources, and genuinely have the space. Yes, we have issues with housing and so on, but actually there are ways in which those communities can absorb people. And what's shown as well is that asylum seekers have an awful lot to give to society. There's lots of research around actually people who come seeking asylum who become really great contributing people to society, because they have an incredible drive to actually improve their life, and as such end up lifting other people up along with them.
Graeme, what about the countries that are taking in refugees? And you mentioned Jordan, for instance, but there's others as well, where they are struggling because of the sheer number of refugees and their own levels of poverty at the same time. Is it particularly difficult for them to actually help these people?
It is, and I think it's a good point to consider, because you have this perception of that the UK is ultimately the big destination that everybody wants to get to. It is an attractive destination, but we are, I think it's 15th in the EU when it comes to the number of refugees that we're actually taking into our country. And if you look at countries like Uganda or Jordan, they host millions more with far fewer resources than what we are doing. So proportionately, really we don't actually host that many in compared to other countries. I think 75% of the world's refugees are hosted in low to middle income countries neighboring their own. So these are not people who are traveling across seas, etc., to get there, but actually going to the nearest safe place, places like Uganda, for example, places like Jordan, Pakistan. So we are far from being the primary destination, certainly in the West. And the people that are making it here, I remember talking with some people when I was working for the Salvation Army many years ago, talking with some refugee and asylum seekers in Greece when there was a real massive sort of sudden explosion of the numbers of people who were landing on the shores of the Greek islands. And talking to people who'd ended up in a square in Victoria Square in the middle of Athens. And, these were desperate people with babies, people with elderly grandparents who they grabbed everything that they possibly could in, literally plastic bags. And they abandoned everything that they'd ever built and created and grown and established of their daily lives, and have fled to the nearest possible way. And most of them were Syrian refugees at that stage, seeking safety, going across perilous journeys on small boats because that was the best option for their scenario. I guess it's when you start to see the humanity of people, you look past all of the statistics, you look past all of the numbers, you look past all of the rhetoric, and you see that these are people just like me. I have far more in common with you, the person seeking safety, than actually I realize. And when we start to see that kind of humanity, I think we start to take on more of the love and grace that we're called to as Christians as well.
You're listening to A Christian Response on TWR-UK with me, Dave Piper. Over the course of this series, we're taking a look at how Christians are responding to some of the major issues in communities across the UK and around the world. If you'd like to get in touch to share your thoughts on the issues we're covering, then please do feel free to email. The email address is studio@twr.org.uk. That's studio@twr.org.uk. For most of us, the global policy issues are really not anything to do with us, but many of us will, at some point in our lives, come across refugees, asylum seekers, and the like. Does the Bible actually tell us how we should interact with them, how we should treat people at that really vulnerable point in their lives?
Yeah, I think there's a few different points on here. I think, first of all, there's this sort of, I guess, proximity trap that we fall into. I guess we often confuse visibility with scale. Because we see the boats on the news, we think they're the whole story. But, 41,000 people, that's less than the capacity of a mid-sized football stadium. And as Christians, we shouldn't let the volume of the news drown out the value of that individual soul. So I think that's the first point. I think the second point is about how can we be involved in the prevention versus reaction. And I really align massively to this. My whole career really has been essentially in development. My current role in UWS is all about actually helping ensure that children have the best education that they can in low and middle income countries, because actually we know that education is one of the greatest transformational points of people being able to establish a better life for themselves and fulfill their potential. And so by working in remote, poverty-stricken situations, actually you're able to turn the tide and help whole communities, not just the children themselves, but whole communities transform. And so, we see those kind of interventions, that kind of aid, as a primary defense against the desperation that leads to refugee movements. And this is aside from war, of course, as well. But if a community has schools and stability and hope and peace, the push factors of displacement are clearly weakened. And so as Christians, again, our response should be both welcoming those who arrive and investing in the dignity of those who want to stay. And, we've been navigating this recently with the conflict in the Thai-Cambodia border. We've navigated this recently in Madagascar with a coup attempt that overthrew the government, likewise in Nepal. These are situations where the most vulnerable, like children in schools, have their worlds turned upside down, and it becomes very, very scary for those situations. But there is a biblical mandate. And, the Bible mentions the sojourner or the foreigner I think it's over 200 times. It isn't a secondary issue for God. It's central. And so when we talk about this burden of refugees, we have to remember that Christ described his own yoke as easy and his burden as light, if that makes sense. Perhaps our burden is actually an invitation to participate in God's hospitality, to show that love and mercy and compassion to those who end up on our shores, and to model something of that to the wider society, to choose a different path and a different way, and to really love our neighbour into action.
Graeme, do you think that as Christians we're also called to do what we can towards getting a world that is peaceful? We're aware that there will be wars right up until the end of human history, but should we still be almost campaigning on behalf of peace as Christians?
Absolutely. And I think there's a really interesting balance here around being a pacifist versus being an active peacemaker. Being a pacifist is admirable in many ways. We've seen some great examples and great models of people who are pacifists in the world who've chosen that path, and we can learn from that and we can be inspired by that. But I think there's also a piece around being an active peacemaker, and I think when we look at that, we're thinking about sort of Matthew chapter 5, where it talks about blessed are the peacemakers. We're sort of moving the conversation from passive pacifism to active peacemaking, working to address the root causes of conflict, like inequality and like lack of education. Again, this is for me where I really sit in terms of my own calling and the work that I'm involved in. I want to be part of something that makes life better for where people call home. That doesn't mean that I won't welcome them to my shore when they need help, but it means that actually the best possible solution is for people to be able to grow and thrive in their own culture and own settings and own home where they want to be, and have the choices beyond that once they have that life. To live a life wherever you are on the planet that, is at least as good in terms of the privilege that I have, in their own context. So I think when we start to move into active peacemaking, then we're also called to that sort of advocacy element, using the church's voice to call for safe and legal routes, to ensure that, the Christian response is one of justice, not just charity, not just, giving money and supporting those kind of things, but also about kind of presenting justice options, about the way that we structure our own legislation, that we start to, present a different picture to people, showing the humanity of people, practical help like English lessons, welcome boxes, or, just inviting a refugee family to your house for a Sunday roast or whatever it is that you want to serve up. I know my church has been involved in the community sponsorship scheme. And, we helped to resettle a family. We were able to secure a house and to support them. And even now, that family is kind of moved on from that home. They've established jobs and so on. But even now, there are times when, some of the kids who attend local schools, have asked for some help, or the mother has asked for some help with this, that, or the other. And just knowing that they have a support network when everything else for them has been stripped away is such a powerful example, I think, of God's hospitality, and is what we're called to. And I think that example is not just about doing the right thing, but it's also about modeling something to society, about humanizing the people who have become called refugees. Because at the heart of it, they're still people. That's the label that's been put on them. But I think that sort of community integration, that advocacy, moving beyond the headlines, all of that is part of that active peacemaking that we're called to.
Graeme, just finally, as we move towards an end of this week's episode, is it valuable, do you think, for us in our churches to be regularly praying for specific parts of the world, for specific situations we're made aware of, where there is conflict and war, where refugees are fleeing?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's a big part of our activity. Yes, active peacemaking, that could involve protest, that could involve hospitality. But, prayer is central to our faith as Christians. And actually, if we are going to put that faith into action, we need to be interceding for these situations. I love it. If you've ever been to Southwark Cathedral in London, they have a sort of section on the side, the left-hand side of the cathedral, which has 4 years a map of Zimbabwe and a place where you can light candles and write prayers for Zimbabwe. Now, they have had that for literally decades because they were praying for the situation in Zimbabwe when it was under Mugabe's rule, for the atrocities that were being perpetuated there, praying for those people that had been affected by that, praying for justice, praying for democracy, praying for the people that had sought a better life because their family was being persecuted by political belief and so on. And even now, after some of those things have been resolved, Zimbabwe still has a lot of challenges, but after some of those things have been resolved, they continue in prayer. And, I'm really inspired by that kind of faithfulness and intercession, that actually, we're not just going to move on from that issue when the headlines phase, but actually we're going to continue praying and interceding, believing that God doesn't need us to ask him to do things, to act, but actually we're entering into the plan that God is enacting. We're entering into the rescue and the reconciliation and the restoration of a broken world by coming into that flow of prayer, that conversation with God. And it brings us to our own consciousness and leads us into action. So yes, we start to pray, but actually that prayer leads us into action that we can then tangibly take as well. So intercession is 100%, a big part of that. And praying for that keeps our mind focused on those things, but it also helps us to listen to God's voice in ways that we can inspire others, we can join with others, we can show and share hospitality and love and grace in even greater ways.
Graeme Hodge, thank you for joining us this week on the programme. And that's all we got time for on this week's episode of A Christian Response. I'm Dave Piper, and it's been a pleasure to have your company over the past half hour as we've taken a closer look at how Christians are responding and can respond to the major issues in life, whether that's in our own towns and cities, across the nations of the UK, or even reaching out into the wider world. If you'd like to get in touch to share your thoughts on the issues we're discussing, then please do feel free to email. The email address is studio@twr.org.uk. That's studio@twr.org.uk. And you can stream or download this week's episode now in full at the website. Just go to twr.org.uk/on-demand and search for A Christian Response.
This podcast is a production of Transworld Radio UK. For more information, go to our website at twr.org.uk.